So I've taken a somewhat long hiatus from YouTube due to personal issues in school. However, sometime back, the Messianic Manic made a response to me where he attempts to defend the grammatically incoherent notion that the mind is an activity of the brain, or more precisely, that I'm a process and so can you. So it's time to make a response.
I have you now.
So let's see what he has to say.
He believes that the soul must exist because it is simply impossible, even nonsensical, for the mind to simply be a program carried out by the brain. In support of this view, he often cites the Chinese room thought experiment. This experiment asks you to imagine a guy in a room in which he is receiving messages in Chinese. He doesn't speak Chinese, but he has an instruction manual that tells him how to do the calculations that an artificially intelligent computer program would do if that program did understand Chinese. And this gives him the ability to formulate responses that are indistinguishable from the ones one would expect from a person with a genuine understanding. John Searle, the guy who came up with the thought experiment, doesn't believe that the program the guy is carrying out can have any real conscious understanding of the messages or the responses it formulates, despite the fact that it is able to seem as though it understands. How can it be that a room with a guy who speaks no Chinese, shuffling papers around, doing calculations, can have any real conscious understanding of these messages? How can the program he is carrying out have such an understanding? The problem with this thought experiment is that it assumes, baselessly I think, that witnessing the operation of a conscious process should be comparable to the experience had by a brain or computer program which is undergoing that process. For example, it seems to assume that if the program is mentally picturing the color purple, then we should see the color purple somewhere in there when we see the program doing this. I think this is a very silly non sequitur. Rat seems to think that since it's the case that when you look at the program running, you don't see its subjective experiences, this proves it's not really having subjective experiences.
You misunderstand. It's not just that I don't have the computer's first-person perspective in seeing the color purple. The trouble is that computations are merely actions, and actions are purely syntactic in nature. Actions are defined in terms of how they rearrange things. They don't, however, define things in themselves, such as, for instance, the ideation of purpleness, which is itself a semantic concept, and not merely an activity. Furthermore, if you make a simple modification to the Chinese room experiment, you can see this very easily. I'll call this variation of the experiment the Chinese savant. Imagine that a savant enters the Chinese room and memorizes the contents of the Chinese grammar books. He now leaves the room and performs all of the grammar manipulations in his head and is therefore able to speak fluent Chinese. Now, if you're right, an understanding of Chinese is contained within the computations themselves, he should have understanding of Chinese since he is carrying out those same computations in his mind. The only trouble is that he clearly does not understand Chinese, since he is only manipulating symbols according to grammar rules in his mind rather than understanding their semantic content. Now, if you notice, the Chinese savant gets around the issue of the masked man fallacy as well. Given that we can clearly put ourselves in the position of the savant, we do not have understanding of Chinese just by manipulating symbols in our heads. Since as the Chinese savant you have first-person knowledge of the Chinese symbol manipulation rather than third-person knowledge, the masked man fallacy would not apply as this is your own consciousness rather than someone else's. And of course to say that one's own consciousness could be masked from oneself is a contradiction with the very notion of consciousness in the first place. One would have to be unaware of one's awareness, but this is of course an oxymoron. Now I'd like to further point out a deeper problem with the notion of the mind being a process that shows it to be nonsensical to begin with. A process requires a processor to conceive of it. For instance, you cannot imagine computations occurring without a computer to perform them. You can, however, imagine the mind in complete isolation to anything else, including the processor that is supposedly processing it. The mind, therefore, cannot be a process. And since the ability to conceive of the mind in isolation from anything else also happens to be at the root of Cartesian skepticism, which in turn is the grounds for all knowledge, any claim you make to the contrary would simultaneously destroy any knowledge claim you could make, including the knowledge claim that the mind is a process. Furthermore, given that the mind can be conceived of entirely independently of the notion of a process, it follows that the concept of the mind is not even related to the concept of a process, which in turn makes me ask the following question.
Thoughts are not a process. Where do you even get this idea?
Minds are not a process, and calling them a process just because their activities happen to correlate to processes is what we refer to as the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. Just because y happens to correlate to x does not mean that you have justification to claim that y actually is x.
It sounds like you're pulling this stuff completely out of your ass. It sounds like you don't believe this stuff for any rational reason.
So what are minds? Well, according to quantum cognition, which models cognition in terms of Hilbert space mathematics, minds behave as quantum fields comprised of individual thoughts which are modeled as wave functions, or what Michio Kaku would refer to as...
They're waves. Waves of vibration.
Researchers have found that fuzzy logic, such as what you do when you are undecided which video response to do next, is better modeled in terms of quantum superpositioning, rather than the sort of straightforward logic one would expect if your mind were a process on a classical computer. And of course, this is corroborated by the evidence.
Patients under general anesthesia are unconscious, but if you do evoked potentials or measure EEG, their brains are quite active. We use evoked potentials all the time in spine surgery, and the brain is neurocomputing away in the absence of consciousness. What does disappear only is the gamma synchrony. So here we have gamma synchrony, and basically what's happening is that proteins in the front of the brain are oscillating coherently, and proteins in the back of the brain are oscillating coherently. And Walter Freeman and Giuseppe Vitiello, and in a separate paper, E. Roy John, concluded that normal neural processes shown here cannot account for this synchrony, and that some quantum effect must be at play in the brain to account for gamma synchrony.
You can even modify a conscious state by altering these vibrations. For instance, in quantum smell, shifting the vibration of a molecule will cause it to interact with our central nervous systems in such a way as to produce a different perception in our consciousness.
How Lucas says, he says, well, you know, this molecule, the first one, say the one found, the organic one found in nature, has a grassy, sharp, slightly sweet smell like a fine Marlboro Sauvignon Blanc. Whereas the one that has the slightly different thing, which presumably is sitting at the same receptor, smells like rotten eggs. So how can this be? They're locking in the same receptors. So the theory is that even if the shape of the molecule is the same, so it locks in the same receptors, because it's got this slight difference, where this piece is heavier, this deuterium is twice as heavy as ordinary hydrogen, it vibrates in a different fashion. So the hydrogen bond is vibrating like this, but the deuterium bond is vibrating like this. And this kind of wave-like nature is a peculiarly quantum kind of effect. And somehow this receptor is able to sense this vibrational difference by absorbing a single quantum of sound, a vibrational quantum from the molecule. You could think of it as like the quantum of smell.
And this is, of course, exactly what you would expect if idealism were true. The quantum information in the wave function is non-local, which the physicist you are so fond of citing when it comes to refuting Craig tells us is outside of space-time. So if you look at an idealist universe, this is exactly what you would expect. The thoughts simulating the physical world would naturally not be in the space-time of the world they are simulating. They would be non-local. Of course, though, you don't want an explanation that makes sense, because you would rather believe in strings of words linked together in grammatically incoherent ways, such as, I am a verb, or I am a process, and so can you.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
Now as to Berkeley's argument, this is unrelated to the topic of the rest of this video, but since you brought it up in yours, I figured I'd address it.
The problem with the Berkeleyan variety of idealism to which Rat subscribes is that it inescapably implies solipsism. In fact, it implies atheistic solipsism. Rats and Berkeley believe that the idea of matter existing independent of the concept of matter is incoherent, because anytime you think of matter, you're thinking of the concept. You can't think of non-conceptual matter because you can't think of anything non-conceptual. Berkeley says that besides spirits, all that we know or conceive are our own ideas. Bertrand Russell quite astutely points out that he ought not, of course, to make an exception for spirits, since it is just as impossible to know spirit as to know matter. Berkeley's argument, if it is correct, is as problematic for theism as it is for materialism. If it is incoherent to speak of matter as having any existence independent of one's thoughts of matter, then it is also incoherent to speak of God having any existence independent of one's thoughts of God. If Berkeley's arguments about the ontology of non-concepts is true, all other minds, including God, cannot be anything more than concepts.
I haven't actually used Berkeley's argument. I've used the digital physics argument and the introspective argument. I actually hold to a slightly different version of idealism than what Berkeley laid out. Now, it is true that we only ever conceive of concepts. However, there is a difference between something being conceived and something being conceivable. Idealism does not necessarily mean that something has to be conceived by us to exist, but rather that it is conceived by someone. In particular, on what is called objective idealism, which is what I hold to, the world can be made of mental substance even if that substance is out there in some sense. For instance, if one were to analogize the world to a matrix simulation in God's mind, the world would be made of a construct of thought, even if those thoughts were not thoughts in our mind. I hope that clarifies my idealism for you. Thank you. Goodbye.
All too easy.
If you like this video, subscribe and support me on Patreon. And don't forget to check out my novel, Alaris, The Lances of Light, on Amazon Kindle in the description below. You can find us on Facebook as well at Idealism and Science versus Atheism.